What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the new blood-curdling action flick Sisu, which is going into limited release in North America this Friday. And not to worry, I won't give away any spoilers, but it's not really one of those movies that can be spoiled. I mean, you could go into really specific, brutal action beats or explain how it ends, neither of which I'll do. But this is just a murderous extravaganza of violence from start to finish throughout all 91 minutes. And if you haven't seen the trailer, I would recommend you go do so, because I feel like the Red Van trailer does a perfect job of teeing up exactly what to expect. And if you like what you see in the trailer, you're going to like the movie. I would argue that it's probably a niche audience that likes their action movies to go like this hard into the paint or this deep into the paint, because the violence in this, it's not that kind of like slick, polished, like well choreographed action that you might see in a movie like John Wick. And a lot of people are comparing it to John Wick. They should not. You're setting up unrealistic expectations. The violence in this is much more like a really gruesome horror movie, where it's really brutal and it's really visceral and it's really gory and it's in your face. And there are people who are absolutely going to watch this and say, fuck yeah, this is what I've been waiting for. Like, how come we don't get these more often? But I'm not going to lie and tell you that you should pack all the kids and all their friends into the station wagon and head to the movie theater to see this, unless those kids happen to love really gruesome, hardcore, R-rated violent movies. And I know those kids are out there because I was one of them back in the day. But most kids probably would prefer to go see Super Mario Brothers. So pick your poison. But if you're unfamiliar with the premise of the movie, it takes place in 1944 in a remote part of Finland. The Nazis are on the run. However, while they're on the run, they're basically leaving a path of destruction in their wake. And they stumble upon this old-timer who's out in the middle of nowhere mining for gold, and he's just found like the absolute motherlode, and all he's trying to do is get his gold to a bank. And he's got a dog, he's got a horse, and he's got a rifle, and he looks like he's just carved out of stone or made out of leather. He's just a mean old bastard. And these Nazis decide to start fucking with him, and they learn to their horror, or they learn to their chagrin in very short order, that this guy used to basically be like a one-man death squad in the Finnish army. And a long time ago, used to be fighting against the Russians, where he racked up hundreds of confirmed kills. And now he's more than happy to share all of his deadly skills and expertise with these guys who decided to try and interfere with his ability to cash in. And let me just reiterate that this is not a Finnish version of John Wick. The tone, the style, the overall approach is completely different. I mean, there are going to be some parallels, like you've got a central character who doesn't talk much or at all until, well, late or deep into the movie. But this is a movie that's much more concerned with just greed and brutality and revenge and cruelty. And I must admit, this is my first exposure to writer-director Jalmari Helander, if I'm saying his name correctly, but I will be following his career closely from now on because he's got some serious chops. And what I really enjoyed most about his approach is that it's one of those movies that felt like it should have been a super ultra low budget movie, like made in the late 60s or early 70s. It would play in midnight movie theaters or grindhouse theaters or drive-in theaters or whatever the case might be. And it's not a super big budget movie, but it's got this polish and production value that you usually don't find with these kinds of hard R violent action movies, because this is not a movie that's trying to make you think deeply or profoundly about World War II. It's not going for realism. It's not trying to say anything profound. It's not trying to make any political statements, in spite of the fact that the bad guys are Nazis in the flick. So obviously some people are going to take the ball and run with it. But it's just trying to provide this really relentless experience. And it's almost like the filmmaker just happened to use World War II as the backdrop, which was pretty common in the late 60s, where you had a lot of really violent adventure movies. And I emphasize the word adventure movies. They weren't like a deep historical analysis of World War II. They were designed to be thrill rides. And I'm talking about movies like The Dirty Dozen or Where Eagles Dare, where a lot of veterans would criticize them for being a little over the top. However, they were extremely fun and extremely violent and absolute classics of their time. And I'm not trying to claim that the next Where Eagles Dare or Dirty Dozen has arrived. However, it does have a lot of DNA in common with those, where it just happens to be a bloody good time with World War II as the backdrop. I should probably add, what the hell is the definition of Sisu? And here's the definition from Wikipedia. They use their own version or their own definition at the opening of the movie, but here's what it says on Wikipedia. Sisu is a Finnish concept described as stoic determination, tenacity of purpose, grit, bravery, resilience, and hardiness. and is held by Finns themselves to express their national character. It is generally considered not to have a literal equivalent in English. Tenacity, grit, resilience, and hardiness are much the same things, but do not necessarily imply stoicism or bravery. In contemporary psychology, Sisu is shown to have both beneficial and harmful sides. Long story short, what Sisu means for the central character is that he's just one of those guys who refuses to die. He's not necessarily the biggest or the fastest or the strongest or the most technical or the most skilled, but he's just relentless, and he spends the entire movie like removing pieces of shrapnel from his body, or removing bullets from his body, or sewing himself up with barbed wire, whatever the case might be. He just will not fucking die, and it's absolutely delightful just seeing a guy who's just got this gritty determination. He doesn't have a noble higher purpose. He's not trying to single-handedly win World War II. He's just trying to get to the bank. And I should probably add that the film stars several actors, all of whom have names that I'm going to completely butcher and mispronounce, but the main lead, Jorma Tomila, as well as Axel Henne, Jack Doolan, and Mimosa Wilamo. If I'm even remotely like in the ballpark or in the neighborhood of the correct pronunciation of their names, I'd be shocked and amazed. And I'd say on the whole, the acting is solid. Like, the characters are more or less one-dimensional. They have a single purpose. It's like mean Nazi commander, psychotic Nazi rapist, greedy gold prospector. Like, there's not a lot of depth or nuance or sophistication to the way these characters are portrayed. They're basically just on a collision course, and then blood has to flow. And all of them are more or less able to give to the movie what is asked of them from the screenplay. And speaking of the screenplay, the inspiration for the story came from both the 1982 film First Blood, which I've seen a billion times, as well as the real-life Finnish military sniper Simo Haya. So once again, without going into any spoilers, let me call attention to some of the best qualities of the movie, a few minor critiques that I have, and then we'll wrap up this video and we'll all go home. So let's start with the easy part. Very short. It's 1 hour and 31 minutes. I feel like this year has seen the return of the great, tight, economical feature. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for a really long movie. If the filmmaker needs that lengthy running time to tell their story, like a movie like The Deer Hunter, I would not want The Deer Hunter to be condensed. However, in what's basically a murder, revenge, greed fantasy, 91 minutes is more than ample for the story that they're telling here. And as I mentioned before, there's very little dialogue in the movie. It's told almost exclusively with images, which I feel like is what pure raw cinema is all about. And there's some dialogue between the bad guys as they try to figure out what tactics to employ in killing this guy that just refuses to die. But it's a lot of fun having a lead who is just stoic and silent and is really good at killing people. It's like that old expression, speak softly and carry a big stick. Well, holy shit, he carries a big goddamn stick. And as far as the action goes, I would argue that it's got a couple of scenes that are just outstanding. And you see a lot of them in the trailer. Some of the action's not quite as memorable, or it's not quite as clever. And some of it's just so over the top, you're kind of like, all right, you lost me. I have kind of like fallen out of the movie, and now I'm just kind of like observing at a distance as opposed to being completely, totally absorbed. However, I would say on the whole, the action is very satisfying, and there are one or two scenes where like, holy shit, that's extremely clever, extremely imaginative. I've never seen anything quite like that before. I feel like that's the way a lot of Americans reacted to John Woo in the late 80s and the early 90s when they started seeing movies like A Better Tomorrow and The Killer and Hard Boiled, where they just couldn't believe the creativity at play in the action. And I'm not ready to declare this filmmaker the next John Woo, but if you enjoy incredibly creative, brutal, violent action sequences, you will definitely be satisfied by Sisu. And it's just a relief to see this kind of ruthless, savage genre and entertainment being delivered with so much style and production value. Usually these extremely violent movies, they kind of get confined to the more obscure, esoteric, ultra low budget corners of the filmmaking landscape, but holy shit, when you watch this movie, it has all the slickness and polish of like a mid-budget Hollywood movie. And the movie also employs a really cool novelistic structure with certain chapter headings like gold or Nazis or minefield. You kind of know what you're going to get with each section. And some might argue that he's ripping that off from Tarantino, but Tarantino didn't invent the idea of having chapters in a story. But for people who enjoy movies that avoid that traditional 3-act structure, I think they'll find the overall approach to the story very refreshing. But as far as my critiques go, they're very, very few. I thought on the whole that the acting was fine, but no one's going to blow you out of the water and say, oh my God, the next Laurence Olivier has arrived. And there are a couple of characters where you could probably say that the acting borders on amateur. And it was also weird that the movie is almost exclusively in English until the very end, and then the change from English to Finnish feels almost kind of arbitrary. At any rate, I would have preferred everybody just to speak their native language, but the filmmaker is probably trying to make the movie more commercially accessible by doing everything in English. And one really minor criticism that I have is that occasionally the really grim, gritty tone clashes with the kind of over-the-top nature of a lot of the violence. And some are probably going to say, no, that's what makes it fun. That's what makes it unique, is that you have these ridiculous violent moments in a movie that's so serious and relentless. And so, yeah, to each their own. I just feel like there's sometimes where, like, to borrow the phrase, like, it kind of jumps the shark and you're like, all right, I'm officially calling bullshit. I don't care how much of a badass this guy is. But that only happens on a few occasions. On the whole, the action is fantastic. So that's it. I think this movie is going to have, like I said before, niche appeal. There are people out there who love hardcore action movies that'll absolutely love it. But I don't anticipate that in 10 years' time, we're going to be looking back on Sisu as the next big action franchise that'll be 4 movies deep. I feel like it's one and done. It's a good standalone story. Action fans are going to dig it. And if you're not into action, well then go see Super Mario Brothers again or go see something else. But this is a movie that knows precisely what story that it wants to tell, precisely what style and tone it wants to employ, precisely what kind of audience it's pursuing. And it's always refreshing to discover a new filmmaker who's able to deliver really solid entertainment with so much confidence and style. But that's all I've got for now, so I hope you enjoyed this reaction and review. If so, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. Let me know what you think of the flick down in the comments below, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.